in my times where it was very dangerous to drive, I had to put myself into a position that I 100% concentrate on my job. If I do a mistake, I kill myself, and I cannot be disturbed by anything of my 100% concentration, more or less to stay alive over the race weekend. That means you have to block everything out. People have asked me the same question for years. They want to know which championship meant the most to me. They ask about Nürburgring in 1976, about climbing back into a Formula One car only 6 weeks after nearly losing my life, about James Hunt, Ferrari, McLaren, and all the decisions that shaped my career. Those are the stories people remember because they're easy to recognize. They became headlines, documentaries, and history. But every once in a while, someone asks a different question. Not who was the fastest, not who won the most championships, not even who I hated racing against the most. They ask me who the greatest drivers were. That sounds simple until you spend your entire life around Formula One. Greatness isn't measured only by trophies. It isn't measured by pole positions or race victories. I've seen drivers with incredible speed who never fulfilled their potential, and I've seen champions whose greatest strength wasn't speed at all. Sometimes greatness reveals itself in the way a driver handles pressure. Sometimes it's the way he develops a racing car. Sometimes it's the calmness he brings to an entire team when everything around him is falling apart. I've been fortunate enough to witness several generations of Formula One. I raced against some of the finest drivers the sport has ever produced. Later, I watched another generation arrive from the pit wall and the boardroom. Each era had its own heroes, but only a handful left an impression that stayed with me long after the checkered flag had fallen. These are the 5 drivers I believe truly belong among the greatest I have ever known. Let me start with Alain Prost, because no driver taught me more about precision than he did. When I joined McLaren for my comeback in 1982, Alain was still establishing himself as one of the brightest young talents in Formula One. By 1984, we were teammates fighting for the same World Championship, and I had a front row seat to watch what made him different from almost everyone else I'd raced against. The first thing people noticed about Alain was how smooth he looked behind the wheel. Some assumed that meant he wasn't pushing hard enough. That was completely wrong. What made him so dangerous was that he almost never appeared to be driving at the limit, even when he was extracting every last fraction of performance from the car. While other drivers relied on aggression, Alain relied on calculation. He understood exactly how much grip the tires had left, exactly how much fuel he could afford to use, and exactly when patience would win a race that outright speed could not. His greatest strength was never raw qualifying pace, although he certainly had plenty of that. It was his ability to think several laps ahead. He managed races like a chess player, planning moves before anyone else had even recognized the position on the board. Engineers loved working with him because his technical feedback was remarkably clear. Every detail he gave them helped improve the car, and over a long season, those small improvements often became the difference between winning and finishing second. The 1984 season remains one of the finest championship battles I've ever experienced. We drove identical McLarens, worked with the same engineers, and had access to the same equipment. Yet every weekend felt like an examination. By the end of the season, I won the World Championship by just half a point, the closest margin in Formula One history. That statistic is remembered by everyone, but what stays with me isn't the number. It's the relentless consistency Alain maintained from the opening race to the final checkered flag. There were very few mistakes, and every point had to be earned. What I admired most was his discipline. Alain never seemed interested in proving he was the bravest driver or the most spectacular one. He cared about winning championships, and he understood that championships are built through intelligent decisions repeated over an entire season. That requires enormous self-control, especially when everyone around you expects dramatic overtakes and impossible risks. Looking back now, I realize Alain changed the way many people thought about Formula One. He proved that intelligence could be every bit as powerful as courage, and sometimes even more valuable. Whenever people ask me about the greatest drivers I've ever known, his name comes to my mind almost immediately, because very few competitors ever forced me to perform at such a consistently high level every single weekend. Now I'd like to talk about Juan Manuel Fangio. Unlike some of the other names on this list, I never had the privilege of racing against him. By the time I entered Formula One, Fangio had already become a legend whose achievements seemed almost impossible to match. Yet in our sport, there are certain names that every young driver grows up hearing, and his was always at the very top. Before I ever sat in a Formula One car, I already knew that if you wanted to understand greatness, you started by studying Fangio. People often focus on his 5 world championships. And of course, that's an extraordinary achievement. But numbers alone don't explain why drivers from generation after generation continue to speak about him with such respect. What made Fangio different was never simply that he won races. It was the way he adapted to everything around him. He drove for Alfa Romeo, Maserati, Mercedes-Benz and Ferrari, changing teams while continuing to succeed. In any era, adapting to a different car is difficult. In the 1950s, when every machine behaved differently and reliability could never be taken for granted, it required an exceptional understanding of racing. What impressed me most was his judgment. Formula One during Fangio's time demanded far more than courage. Drivers competed on circuits that were unbelievably dangerous by modern standards, often with little protection and almost no margin for error. In those conditions, surviving required intelligence as much as speed. Fangio seemed to understand exactly where that balance existed. He knew when to attack, when to preserve the car, and when simply reaching the finish line would ultimately win the championship. That kind of discipline is something every driver admires because it cannot be taught overnight. One race I always found remarkable was the 1957 German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring. After an extended pit stop dropped him well behind the Ferraris of Mike Hawthorne and Peter Collins, Fangio produced one of the greatest recovery drives Formula One has ever seen. Lap after lap, he broke the circuit record while chasing both cars down before eventually reclaiming the lead and winning the race. Even decades later, drivers still talked about that performance because it combined everything a champion should possess: speed, precision, composure, and complete confidence under enormous pressure. As I spent more years in Formula One, first as a driver and later working with teams, I came to appreciate Fangio even more. Great drivers influence the people around them long after they stop racing. Engineers study them, team principals admire them. Young drivers try to imitate them. Fangio established a standard that remained relevant across entirely different generations of Formula One. Whenever discussions begin about the greatest driver in history, every era naturally has its own candidates. But Juan Manuel Fangio belongs in every one of those conversations. Even though I never shared a grid with him, his legacy shaped the sport that eventually shaped my own life. That alone tells you how extraordinary he truly was. Then there was Ayrton Senna. By the time Ayrton arrived in Formula One, I had already accomplished most of what I wanted as a driver, but I remained deeply involved in the sport for many years afterward. That gave me the opportunity to watch him closely, not just as a fan of great racing, but as someone who understood exactly what it took to extract the last few tenths from a Formula One car. Very quickly, it became obvious that Ayrton belonged in a category of his own. The first thing people noticed was his speed over a single lap. Qualifying was where Ayrton often looked untouchable, but what made him extraordinary was never just that he could drive faster than everyone else. It was the confidence with which he found speed where others couldn't. Every driver talks about feeling connected to the car, yet with Ayrton it seemed as though he trusted the limits of the machine more completely than anyone around him, especially in difficult conditions. He had an ability to sense available grip that very few drivers in history have ever possessed. His performances in wet weather became legendary for a reason. Rain usually reduces the differences between racing cars while exposing the differences between drivers. Ayrton seemed to welcome those conditions because they allowed his natural instincts to take over. The opening laps of the 1993 European Grand Prix at Donington Park remain one of the finest demonstrations of racecraft I've ever witnessed. Starting fifth, he passed 4 cars on the opening lap in changing conditions and immediately controlled the race. Every overtake looked decisive, yet never reckless. Watching it unfold, you understood that you were seeing something very rare. There was another side to Ayrton that impressed me just as much. He demanded perfection from himself every single weekend. That level of commitment inspired the people around him, but it also placed enormous pressure on everyone inside the team. Great champions often raise standards simply through their expectations, and Ayrton certainly did that. Engineers knew they had to deliver their very best because he expected nothing less. Whether during qualifying simulations, race preparation, or technical discussions, his focus never seemed to fade. Of course, people also remember the intensity of his rivalry with Alain Prost. Their battles defined an era of Formula One and pushed both drivers to extraordinary heights. Rivalries like that are never comfortable, but they often produce the highest level of competition our sport can offer. Looking back today, it's impossible to tell the story of late 1980s Formula One without speaking about both men together, because each one forced the other to become even better. When I think about Ayrton now, I don't only remember the victories or the pole positions. I remember a driver whose absolute commitment to excellence changed the expectations of an entire generation. He reminded everyone that greatness isn't always comfortable to witness because it demands everything from the person pursuing it. That's why, even decades later, Ayrton Senna remains one of the greatest Formula One drivers I have ever known. And then there was Michael Schumacher. I watched Michael from several different perspectives over the years, and that's something very few people in Formula One can say. I saw him arrive as a remarkably gifted young driver in the early 1990s. I watched him build Ferrari into the dominant force of an entire generation. Later, when I became non-executive chairman at Mercedes, I had the opportunity to work alongside him during the final chapter of his Formula One career. Those experiences only strengthened my belief that Michael belongs among the greatest drivers the sport has ever produced. The first thing that stood out wasn't simply his speed. Formula One has always been full of fast drivers. What made Michael exceptional was the intensity he brought to every aspect of the job. He never viewed racing as something that happened only on Sunday afternoon. Every test session, every engineering meeting, every simulator discussion, every lap mattered. He approached Formula One as a complete profession rather than a series of races, and that attitude elevated everyone working around him. His technical understanding was extraordinary. Engineers often spoke about how precise his feedback could be, after only a handful of laps. He wasn't satisfied with identifying a problem. He wanted to understand why it existed and how the team could eliminate it. That level of involvement helped Ferrari develop into an organization capable of dominating Formula One between 2000 and 2004. Winning 5 consecutive World Championships required much more than a brilliant driver. It required someone capable of uniting hundreds of people behind a common goal, and Michael did exactly that. I also admired the way he handled pressure. Every champion faces enormous expectations, but Michael spent years carrying the hopes of Ferrari, the most famous team in Formula One. Every victory was celebrated across Italy, while every defeat became national news. Many drivers struggle under that kind of attention. Michael seemed to transform it into motivation. Week after week, season after season, he maintained an astonishing level of consistency while continuing to demand improvements from both himself and the team. When Michael returned to Formula One with Mercedes in 2010, many people judged him only by the results. I looked at something different. I saw the professionalism he brought into the garage every morning. I saw the respect younger engineers had for him and the willingness he showed to help develop a team that wasn't yet ready to fight for championships. Although he didn't add another title during those 3 seasons, the work done during that period helped establish many of the foundations Mercedes would later build upon. Sometimes a driver's greatest contribution isn't measured by trophies, but by what he leaves behind for those who follow. Looking back now, I don't think Michael's greatest legacy is simply 7 World Championships. It's the standard he established for preparation, discipline, and commitment. He showed that natural talent can take you very far, but relentless work can take you even further. That's why, whenever I think about the greatest drivers Formula One has ever seen, Michael Schumacher will always be one of the first names that comes to mind. Finally, I have to talk about Lewis Hamilton. Some people might think it's unusual for someone from my generation to place a modern driver on a list like this, but I never believed greatness belonged to one era. Formula One changes constantly. The cars change, the regulations change, the technology changes. Truly great drivers find a way to evolve with all of it. And that's exactly what Lewis has done throughout his career. I was fortunate enough to watch much of that journey from inside the Mercedes team, and it gave me a perspective very few people had. One of the decisions I'm proudest of after my driving career was helping convince Lewis to join Mercedes for the 2013 season. At the time, many people believed he was making a mistake by leaving McLaren, where he had already become a world champion. The outside world questioned the move because Mercedes had not yet established itself as the dominant force it would later become. But I believed Lewis saw something beyond immediate results. He understood that building something great sometimes requires patience before success arrives. What made Lewis different was never just his incredible speed over one lap. Plenty of drivers can produce extraordinary qualifying performances. Lewis combined that speed with remarkable adaptability. Throughout his career, Formula One has gone through dramatic technical changes, from naturally aspirated engines to hybrid power units, from different tire suppliers to entirely new aerodynamic regulations. Every time the sport changed, Lewis remained one of the benchmarks. That kind of longevity isn't an accident. It comes from a willingness to keep learning even after you've already reached the top. His racecraft also impressed me enormously. Lewis possessed an exceptional ability to understand how a race was developing long before the decisive moments arrived. He could preserve his tires when necessary, attack when opportunities appeared, and remain calm even under intense pressure. The 2018 season demonstrated that perfectly. Ferrari often had a car capable of matching Mercedes, Yet Lewis consistently delivered performances that maximized every opportunity. Championships are rarely won by spectacular moments alone. More often, they are won through relentless consistency over many months. And Lewis mastered that better than almost anyone I've ever seen. Working with him inside Mercedes also showed me qualities that television cameras rarely capture. Lewis cared deeply about the people around him. He spent time with engineers, mechanics, and factory staff because he understood that championships are never won by one individual. The strongest teams are built on trust, and Lewis earned that trust through professionalism and respect. Those relationships became one of Mercedes' greatest strengths during its years of dominance. When I look back on Lewis Hamilton's career, I don't simply see the victories or the championships. I see a driver who proved that greatness isn't about staying comfortable once you've reached the summit. It's about continuing to improve when everyone else is trying to catch you. Every generation produces a handful of drivers who redefine what excellence looks like. For me, Lewis Hamilton unquestionably belongs in that rare company, and I have no doubt that Formula One will be talking about his legacy for many decades to come. Tip closing, high jump to. As I sit here looking back, I realize Formula One gave me far more than trophies or championships ever could. Those things matter, of course. I worked my entire life to win them, but time has a way of changing what you value. The statistics eventually become part of record books. Someone breaks another record, another generation arrives, and the sport keeps moving forward. What never fades are the people. The men I raced against, the champions who came before me, and the drivers I later watched from the pit wall all shaped the way I understood this sport. Every one of them approached Formula One differently. Some relied on intelligence, some on instinct, some on relentless preparation, and some seemed capable of finding speed that nobody else could even imagine. There was never only one path to greatness. I was fortunate to share my life with extraordinary competitors. We pushed one another to become better, and in doing so, we pushed Formula One forward as well. Looking back now, that's what I'm most grateful for. When the engines fall silent and the crowds go home, what remains isn't just who crossed the finish line first. It's the respect earned from the people who understood exactly what it meant to line up on the grid, knowing every race demanded absolute commitment. Those are the memories I'll carry with me for the rest of my life, and that's why these 5 men will always have my deepest respect.